Hello, my name is Nathan Cohen, and I'm the course leader for the MA Art and Science at Central St. Martin's. Welcome to the 2020 MA Art and Science Symposium. This has been a momentous year. It has been a time for reflection, but also for invention. Usually, we would be speaking to you in the main lecture theatre at Central St. Martin's, but for obvious reasons, this is not possible this year. So, instead, we celebrate now the achievements of this year's graduates, both in the online graduate showcase and in this webcast symposium. This is the 8th year to graduate with a Master's in Art and Science, and we will hear presentations by 8 of those who are graduating this year. There will be 2 sets of presentations with questions and answer sessions to follow, and with a short break in between each session. A wide range of topics are covered, revealing the breadth of interests on the course, and each session will be recorded, lasting about 45 minutes and shared by one of the MA Art and Science staff team. But to begin with, I would like to invite Heather Barnett, who is an artist and course pathway leader, to say a few words before we commence. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the symposium.
Hello everyone, welcome to the MA Art and Science 2020 Symposium. I'll be moderating this evening's event. We've got a great number of attendees coming in, so we'd love to have your questions and comments. The format for the event will be, as Nathan said, it's in 2 sessions. There'll be 4 presentations, short presentations, followed by a group Q&A. Without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Adrian Holm, who's going to chair the first session. Adrian is a writer, an artist, and associate lecturer on MA Art and Science. Adrian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Heather. So welcome to this first session, and it's entitled More Than Human. And it presents work by 4 of our artists that are what you might think are contextualized by the Anthropocene. Our 4 artists are Phil Barton, Catherine Herbert, Debi-Sara Wilkinson, and Mariana Heilmann, and they draw inspiration from trees, salt marshes, beekeeping, and mycelium. Their work reveals shared interests in science, philosophy, psychology, and the more than human world of which we are a part. So I'd like first to introduce Phil Barton. Phil has worked for over 30 years on local environmental regeneration, and on the master's course has been building on his concern for nature and our natural life support systems through his developing artistic practice. His contribution opens with one of his great influences, the auto-destructive artist Gustav Metzger.
You appeal to arts professionals from all disciplines to take a stand against the ongoing erasure of species. It is our privilege and our duty to be at the forefront of the struggle. There is no choice but to follow the path of ethics into aesthetics. We live in societies suffocating in waste. Our task is to remind people of the richness and complexity in nature, to protect nature as far as we can. And by doing so, art will enter territories that are inherently creative.
Artists' relationship to the land and to the environment have come a long way since Gainsborough painted the owners of the land and somebody else painted the imperialist possession by the British of the land. In the 1960s, very much at the dawn of the Anthropocene, the land artists moved out of the galleries and began to do things to nature and in nature, using nature itself as their materials. But it's been since the 80s that eco-art has emerged as a balance between the aesthetic and the ethics, between politics and poetry. Joseph Beuys led the way with his 7,000 oaks, a living social sculpture in the castle in Germany, created as part of his attempt to bring together society and nature in a more constructive way. And on my time here at Central St Martin's over the last 2 years, I have been exploring my role as an eco-artist and exploring the 6th great extinction. Trees, like Beuys for me, have been a central feature, and I'd like to just briefly describe to you the work that I did, firstly with Catherine Herbert, my fellow student who's here tonight, on protesting Bolsonaro's election as president of Brazil, committed to cutting down and turning into agriculture the rainforest and evicting the indigenous people while they're doing so. And macaws, which I saw when I visited Peruvian Amazon back in 2000 in their great numbers, was the focus for work that we did as an indicator species for the health of forests. And as a result of a workshop that we did at the Tate Exchange, I did a whole series of experimental prints which are exploring the relationship between camouflage, between the background and the foreground, between the healthy and the sick. In doing so, I was really struck by the balance between the light and life and colour of the birds, of the macaws, and indeed of the jungle behind them. But when seen in black and white, of course, they merge into one. And I found the interplay between our ways of seeing the environment, ways of seeing ourselves, our ways of seeing nature, as being something that I'm extremely interested in. And then I went on to do a project working with the Medical Research Council and 4 medical researchers in very different fields. One of them was working on antimicrobial resistance to antibiotics. One of them was working on diet and health. One was working on environmental pollution and health. And then I also worked with a scientist from Kew Gardens who was working on the health of oak trees. So we set up a thought experiment. What is the difference, what is the similarity between the health of an urban tree and the health of a disadvantaged person who has no agency about where they live? And we found all sorts of interesting links. And then the final piece of work I'd like to talk to came out of my work at Kew and very much focuses on using material from plants, from trees, as the basis of the creative process. By reproducing them on paper through print, I've been able to produce some really interesting work which I want to take further. And during the course of my studies, I've developed my own model for my practice, adding to the one that I brought into this course the importance of values and of poetics and of politics. And finally, Gustav Metzger, Day of Action. One of the things I'm proudest of at Central St Martin's was the Day of Action to Remember Nature we held in the street last November, and which leaves a legacy for the future for students working to remember nature.
Well, thank you very much for that, Phil. It's now my pleasure to introduce our second artist tonight, who is Catherine Herbert. In the wake of the environmental crisis, Catherine has developed her interest in participation and activism to focus residents from her own community on the local environment.
Hello, hi everybody, thank you for coming and thank you, Phil. I'm now gonna stop my video and start talking. Okay, so I'd like to talk about the Rope Walk, which is my final project that I've made on my MA, and it's made in response to the climate emergency. It also refers to this stretch of countryside, which is from where I'm living at the moment and where I've been developing my practice as an artist with the local community. If we have the next slide, you can see a map of where I'm living, which is a small coastal town called Brightlingsea in Essex, near Colchester. And if we go to the next slide, thank you. Brightlingsea is where I met and I started collaborating with these guys, which are the eco-artist collective Cobnuts, And also I collaborated with the local museum and a local scientist called Roger Tabor to hold oral history events where we audio recorded people's memories, experiences and thoughts of nature and the surrounding landscape. And if we have some next slides, we can see images from those events. One was held in the local museum, the other in a pub. And they were really interesting in the responses that we got from people. The responses were really varied, and often the details were kind of connected because it's a small town. They ranged from anecdotes about life histories, details about traditions, historical traditions such as fishing and boat building and the oyster industry. And the idea was to get people talking and to identify with specifically with the local landscape and the local area, and to edit these together and to play them back to the local community in that context, kind of to nudge people into an environmental awareness in the town. And this hasn't happened yet because of COVID, and we haven't managed to do that, but it is due to be played back in the local museum when it reopens. So among the many things that was mentioned repeatedly was an area of salt marsh, which is known locally as the Rope Walk. And here you can see it's labelled as disused oyster pits. And it's also remembered for the childhood game of mud flat hopping or creek jumping, which is mentioned in the clip that I'm going to play you in a minute. And it's a game that I remember doing as well when I was a child. And in the film clip I'm about to show, I've used underwater footage from this area, and I've edited it together with some of the audio, some of the testimonies that I've chosen, and I've edited together and I put it together to make a short film. So if we have the next slide, you can see these photos were all taken from the Rope Walk, and you can see over the creek to Sindri Island, where there's a salt marsh regeneration project underway because it is an important habitat that's sadly dwindling. And I've chosen to kind of focus on the salt marsh because to me it embodies a sense of ongoingness, I guess, a sense of change. And when the work is finally played back in context in Brightlingsea, specifically to a local audience, I hope that people, residents of town, will be able to identify with the specific areas mentioned, not just this area, but other things, other details that have surfaced through the oral histories. And I hope people will be able to identify with that and get their own sense of kind of how they relate to this kind of ongoing and changing environment and history and surroundings that have been mentioned by the people who participated in the oral history events. So I'm going to play a clip that I've put together for this, but it's also on my graduate showcase. There's a longer bit of film with some of the residents' testimonies and also some of the footage, underwater footage from the Rope Walk. So we can start playing that now. Thank you.
My past memories are when I was a young boy going over the Rope Walk, because we used to live down Tower Street, so we backed onto Lime Street, so we used to walk down Lime Street, go over the Rope Walk, over the old oyster beds, which weren't oyster beds then, but there was still an old oyster, an old shed over there, which probably collapsed, I think, by the time we got over there. But we used to ride our bikes all over there and get completely muddy and drenched and do the old creek jumping and that. So we used to go down there and obviously see lots of wildlife down there. Which, yeah, it was very good. I mean, we used to just do it just for fun, really, and just for a bit of a laugh. We're talking 40 years ago now, over 40 years ago, you know. It's, yes, we used to go down there and have a wonderful time. Great stuff.
Notwithstanding, we're really adjacent to the nest. We'll get them, and then we'll get the sea eagles coming up from the south. And that is a dream to see one of them.
When we were boys, catapults, we would try and get birds, but we never did. You've got to be good. Yeah, so from when I was how old I've been, 19. I've never thought of killing the bird since.
Basically, it's an island out in the middle of nowhere where a lot of the seabirds, seagulls and things hatch their chicks. And you can sort of pull up alongside if you're quiet at that time of year and just watch the parent birds feeding them.
We'll get them, and then we'll get the sea eagles coming up from the south. And that is a dream to see one.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. And I can see there's already questions appearing in the Q&A. So if you've got a question in the audience, then please do type your question in the Q&A and we'll address it after these presentations in the discussion section. So the next person I want to introduce, the next artist, is Debi-Sara Wilkinson. Debi-Sara's creative practice seeks to ask and invite questions as to how we all work better together in an ongoing story, living on a planet that uniquely offers life to many organisms. How do we humans work better with others?
My work as a creative practitioner working with a living organism stems from a relationship I have with honeybees. This is a relationship which is based on a knowledge practice of beekeeping and a love of the environment and being outside. We are not separate from nature. This is a human construct. The term nature is a human construct. And the human and animal world are two complementary and interacting dimensions among which many relationships and interactions are possible. When we look back in time, evidence shows human and animal interactions manifested in many forms of human experience. Humans obtained from animals the means to be able to create their culture, where we often entered into invisible primordial worlds where animals were more like other than human persons. Here, humans became one with those other worlds, which brings me to my beekeeping. I ask, what is it like to be a honeybee? Can I feel or experience a common ground with the honeybee? In our current time, when we enter the realm of other, we enter into a realm of assumptions, prejudices, and pre-formatted concepts. One element in examining this question was first to explore what it is to be human. To attempt this was more difficult than I had initially thought. The relationship with the environment comes more readily for me, but it is important for me to begin with understanding a bit more about myself. When it comes to working with bees and other organisms, it is very important to understand your selected organism as thoroughly as possible, but not to allow this to enable assumptions to arise about what you think you know. I hope to expand from this line of questioning other questions of how we humans might work together better, not only with ourselves, but with those I call other, the animals and the environments in which we all live and share. We are so often proven, especially in our current time, which can testament that we barely understand ourselves. At the heart of my line of questioning, it is important to re-examine those new stories, to re-examine those stories that are told and yet to arise, and to re-examine this ongoing journey on a planet where we all live, especially if we want to be part of that ongoing new story. The relationships that we forge today with those we share the planet with are key to discovering how we all might proceed. And I begin my journey with the relationship of the human with the honeybee. The honeybee is a key species of the planet, which is a good indicator. So this is a very good place for me to start my line of questioning. And this is what I have been doing on my journey over the last 2 years.
Thank you very much, Debi-Sara. And I'd like now to introduce our fourth artist this evening, this first session, who is Mariana Heilmann. Mariana is an Anglo-Colombian artist who uses her practice to understand the science that underpins life. Through the use of a wide range of media, she explores scale, interconnectivity, and ways in which the human world is a meeting point between microscopic and global scales. Currently, she is investigating mushroom mycelial networks and how their interconnected forms of existence relate to the human story.
Thank you, Adrian. Hi, everyone. If we could have the next slide, please, that would be great. Thank you. This is a bird's eye view of my degree project, which you can see in much more detail in the graduate showcase. The project began with my interest in the interconnective and symbiotic relationship that some fungi have with plants and trees. This opened up the vast and complex kingdom of fungi and plunged me into a state of awe and confusion. Running with mycelium is my way of developing an understanding of these extraordinary and mysterious organisms which play a crucial role in our ecology. This is a platform for inquiry. It's a dynamic space where accumulative questions and answers are layered and where observing live mycelium can happen alongside artistic and academic exploration of fungal life. This movable installation is also intended to become a forum where shared curiosity can open conversations and spawn collaborations. Running with mycelium is a layered journey that has already, in its early stages, taken me to unexpected places. What I'd like to share with you today is a behind-the-scenes peek at the first 2 phases of my experience of running with mycelium, oyster mushroom mycelium in particular. The video gives you an idea of the layered process behind mapping the early stages of this journey. I'd like to draw particular attention to the soundtrack, as this is one of those unexpected areas that have opened up as a result of this project. What you'll hear is a direct transcription of the bioelectric activity of an oyster mushroom as it consumes its substrate. The recording is the work of sound ecologist Michael Prime in collaboration with biologist Merlin Sheldrake. Here on the right, you see Merlin holding a copy of his recent book, Intangible Life, which the mushrooms are in the process of consuming. This way of experiencing and understanding mycelial life has opened up new avenues of exploration within my project, which I'll be developing in conjunction with Michael Prime and fungal ecologist Professor Lynn Boddy in the months to come. I hope you'll visit my portfolio platform, where you'll find much more in-depth information about the thinking behind running with mycelium. Also, please do feel free to connect with me if you'd like to be kept informed about the development of the project. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mariana. I see there are some questions coming in the chat, which is great in the Q&A, which is great to see. I'd like to start off with this discussion session. I'd like to invite the participants to switch their cameras on and join us now. The first thing I'd like to ask, actually, all of you, is, do you think that your approach to your subject, to the organisms you work with, to the people you work with, is different to that a scientist might take? The approach you're taking as an artist, is it different to the approach a scientist might take? Who wants to go first? Phil, you want?
Okay, so I think it is. I worked with one group of scientists on the Picture of Health project, and what is so interesting is, of course, when you do get together out of your own professional straitjacket, if you like, is how creative people can be. But what I've discovered over the years before I took up my artistic practice was how different people, although on the surface they think and behave very differently, when you engage with nature, when you engage together, where you look to find common ground, you actually find that there is huge amounts of commonality and connections. And I think what's really interesting about working with nature is that it provides a mechanism for one to achieve that.
Great, thank you. Who wants to go next? Okay, Mariana, do you want to come in?
Oh, okay, well, I think that as an artist, you have the privilege to use your imagination, you can sort of bridge gaps. You're not forced to deliver something. For example, scientists have very specific investigations that they have to follow through. There's quite a rigid process. Whereas an artist can go on all sorts of tangents and come back with an incredible range of areas that have been covered and then weave them together into a narrative that is very particular privilege that we have as artists. So yeah, that would be my observation.
Thank you. Catherine?
Yeah, I think something that's influenced me being on this course is thinking about how scientists start with what's real. So they're working with something that's a specific example, not even an example, but with something that actually exists in reality. Whereas sometimes I think with an artist, it's kind of like it's all according to maybe what your ideas are, where you're coming from. So I think with my work, I wanted to start with actually what's out there, and in this case, it was like tapping into a community.
Indeed, and maybe that was a different approach to the way a sociologist or someone might do it. Thank you, Catherine. Debi-Sara.
Okay, so I came on the course with the initial concept of the art and science of honeybee keeping, and this developed. So my approach is that by doing the science, I am participating by observing on the landing board. I'm actually doing the science through making those notes, observations, calculations, which is quite scientific. And on top of that, I also start to use my intuition. So I have to intuit what's happening inside the hive by making those observations on the landing board and becoming honeybee. So I have to go a step further and become honeybee. So I referred to Nagel's seminal paper on what is it like for a bat to be a bat as part of my research. And how do we as artists then take that further forward? How do we intuit what's going on in combination with the actual science, with the actual beekeeping science? And so for me, my work, which is on the UAL website, is making observations as to what is using that imagination to imagine using the science of what is known, intuiting what I experience in the field and making those combinations, but not making assumptions about what I think I know in the science. I hope, so it's yes and no is my answer. Hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, everybody. There's a question from Q&A from Lynn Bartlett, and Lynn is asking, she points out there's an emphasis on collaborations in the presentations. How did such collaborations get developed? Catherine.
Yeah, collaborating is quite a big thing for me now in my work, and I collaborated with the Eco Artist Collective Cob Nuts in my local town because I answered an ad in a paper which was put there by Susie Jenkins, who runs Cob Nuts, and yeah, I didn't know she was an artist at the time, so it was to do with nature. She'd set up a nature network. And so that's how that collaboration came about. And then we obviously collaborated with the local museum. And then there was the artist Roger Table, he came on board with it. I think he must have heard about it via Margaret Stone from the museum or Susie. So it's a small town. But I do go out of my way to try to collaborate. So I'm in a reading group and we're having an exhibition soon with Phil. I've collaborated with Phil on quite a few things. And I just think I'm interested in kind of interconnectivity. So for me, collaborating is a way of modeling that, I guess.
Great, thank you. Phil, do come in.
I just think collaboration is an attitude of mind. And if you look to collaborate, you will find collaborators. But one of the really interesting things for me on the course is that I've found that nature is in turn a collaborator with me. And it's been just so really interesting. I've been printing directly with plant materials and they've produced these beautiful images for me and with me, and I couldn't have done it without them. And likewise, the large woodcut I made for the picture of health, it was important to me that I was working with wood in a piece which was about human and tree and becoming tree. And so absolutely, I think, you know, collaboration emerges if you're looking for it.
Great, thank you. Mariana.
I think what's really valuable about collaboration is that you have the possibility to bring different expertise together and thereby make something that becomes greater than the sum of its parts. When you have, for example, I haven't yet started the collaboration that I referred to earlier on with Michael Prime and Lynn Boddy, but I'm really excited to start seeing what is going to come out of these three different types of expertise coming together, and what are the observations that we're going to be able to make, what might it trigger for each one of us individually and for the three of us. So I think that's really the great value for it, especially, you know, in this field of art and science, where you have people from very different disciplines coming together, having a dialogue, and completely new things can emerge that wouldn't have happened maybe without that type of conversation.
Great, thank you, Mariana. Debi-Sara.
Mm-hmm.
Debi-Sara, how did your collaboration is a particular collaboration with a particular animal?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking, yeah, I mean, how do you collaborate with another organism? You know, where is agency in that discussion with the honeybee? So it is a careful tread, a careful balance, and there are questions that I have to ask myself about that collaboration. And I think when working with another organism, those questions have to be asked. And I'm in the process of, I mean, I know the things when I'm working in collaboration with my honeybees, I know the things that I don't want to do, and I know the things that I do want to do. So this is an ongoing story for me in my practice, and it's part of a manifesto I'm currently writing. But in terms of working with humans, that's a sense, those senses we have. We know what it is, hopefully, to be human. So yeah, so working with scientists, working with other human beings, we can have those conversations. How do I talk honeybee? Yeah, there are lots of answers I could give to that, which unfortunately I won't have time to talk about at length here. But those are conversations to be had.
Indeed, indeed. There are many more conversations that can be explored at a later date, I'm sure. There's a question on the Q&A from Judith Ward, which is addressed to all the artists, really. Has the pandemic caused you to think differently about art and science? And if so, how? We have about 5 minutes before we break. So if you keep the answers relatively brief. Has the pandemic caused you to think differently about art and science? Has it affected your work?
Well, it's certainly affected my work, Debbie. So you go on. You go on.
Go, Phil.
I was going to say, it's certainly affected my work because I abandoned it all in London and came home to Manchester. And since then, I have spent vast amounts of time sitting on a computer, uploading my work digitally, and I think for me, what it's caused me to really reflect on is this balance between the material, which is always the way I make things. That's what I like to do. I create things, and the digital, which we've been told and is clearly developing. And how do you balance those two together? And that, I'm sure, will be a theme for me going forward.
Yes, and I think for many people across the globe, actually. Mariana.
Did you want to go first, Debi-Sara?
No, you go, Mariana.
Well, the pandemic put me in us all in a situation where we had to discover new ways of doing what we thought we were going to do. And actually, this video that I showed today is a result of the pandemic, because Heather, our tutor, Heather Barnett, has been over the course of the 2 years trying to get me to experiment with video, because she could see that it could be a really good medium for me, and I rejected it and just was really not interested in it. But because of the situation that I found myself in, she suggested it again, and I tried it, and in doing it, I've started discovering all sorts of new ways of working that I never would have found before, including the soundtrack that you hear, that because I made the video, suddenly I recognized a soundtrack that was perfect for this, and I connected with Merlin and Michael, and now we're collaborating. So that was a really fortuitous coming together of things that would not have happened if there hadn't been this lockdown situation.
Sure, thank you, Mariana. Debi-Sara.
So there are two things. One is that I was able to keep on doing my bees. I had to, as a beekeeper, obviously get out there to keep on looking after my bees. And I was also able to connect to people who were not able to look after their bees. And secondly, in terms of going back to my original work, because it allowed me to look at internal spaces, putting the queen bee inside a square box. So for me, this was like a woman in a box, making the selected individual into a specific space. So that enabled me to go back to my original thought practices at the beginning of the course, to consider other elements of my practice, which I hadn't had time to actually develop. And I've been developing other aspects of my practice that I'd started with and can now resume. So that's what the pandemic has enabled me to continue with.
Lovely, thank you, Debi-Sara. Catherine.
Yeah, like Mariana, I've made a video that I wouldn't have made otherwise, so that's interesting. And I've also recently helped to run a workshop in a primary school which was socially distanced, so that was interesting. But also, I think the thing about the pandemic, I guess, is that it kind of has made everyone obviously kind of think again about stuff. And I think the all history events that we've been running, we're planning to do some more. So we might try and ask people how it felt to be in lockdown and what their thoughts are on there. So kind of helping to highlight that with people. I think that's where I would go with it.
That's great.
Can I add something?
Yes, sure, yeah. Of course. Yeah.
So I do see this as a new time, because my work was looking at Renaissance paintings in the beginning, so woman in a box. So I'm sort of I'm going back to those original questions. This being a new Renaissance, a new time to ask new questions about how we all function together, and I think that's kind of a big circle for me in my practice, and that's what this time has enabled me to reconsider.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you very much for that. When we're coming up to the end of this first session, there are lots of questions coming in the chat, and there are some questions directed at individuals, which will be answered during the course of the evening as well. It can be answered by those individuals. Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming. So I'd now like to. There'll be a 5-minute break now. We'll break until 5 minutes until 10 to 8. In order that you can all refill your glasses, have a cup of tea, whatever you're doing. So we'll see you in 5 minutes. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for the panelists.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the MA Art and Science Symposium. Our host for this session is Susan Aldworth, who's an artist and lecturer on the MA Art and Science course.
Hi, welcome back. The 4 artists that we're going to see in the second half of this presentation don't fall into any easy categories, so I'm not going to try and force them to. They span the intangible and subjective concepts of time and memory. Teresa Zerafa Byrne, Diane Wingate, Claire McDermott, and Raji Jagadeesan focus on memory and construction and recall, light and visual perception, spent plants, geobotany and the environment, and location and place with special reference to the COVID-19 pandemic. Don't forget to write any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to start with Diane Wingate. Di will present a short video about light and perception.
Thank you, Susan. I am an optometrist and an artist. My art practice deals with all things to do with visual perception. Tonight, I'd like to bring your attention to one part of my practice, the importance of light. Light is essential. Without light, we would not see. In optometric terms, absolute blindness is defined as no perception of light. I work with the intrinsic properties of light, such as reflection, refraction, diffraction, interference, and light scatter. I utilise these properties of light to make artwork about light. With respect to my art practice, I am purely the facilitator. Light is the artist. I search for shadows, always hunting for the unintended, elusive, fragile image. However, what I find is not totally unexpected. I do know where to look, what to investigate with. I know what surfaces and objects are likely to create good shadows, working with materials that have different abilities to bend and reflect light. Sometimes the light-surface interaction can give surprising, complex or irregular images. These moments are my prizes, moments unique and dependent on many different external properties that they are difficult to replicate. Once they are gone, they are gone. Only the photographic image left as a recording of the moment in time. Tonight, I present a short film of my recent shadow experiments, starring a glass jar, an old tin of paint, and a broken glass screen protector, showing that light can do the most amazing things even when using the most mundane of objects. I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Di, that was fantastic. Next up, we have Raji Jagadeesan. Raji's practice has evolved into film and moving image from an initial starting point of documentary-style photography, from the simple act of looking and observing at a specific moment in time and in a particular location and place.
Thank you, Susan. My practice originates actually in sculpture and 3D work, but I have been increasingly doing film and photography, and with the direct influences from photojournalism and documentary traditions in terms of narrative. And since we live in an era of the visual image, I'm very interested in how documentation and interpretation interact with the image. I'm going to start with 2 recent photography projects and then describe my degree show film. If we can move to the next slide. The slide before, thank you. So I'm actually very interested in how geographical space and the physical settings of locations are layered with historical time. I went to Kosovo last year on the 20th anniversary of the end of the war in Kosovo. I'm from the US and I lived in Washington 20 years ago when there was a pretty uniform consensus about NATO action there. And I was interested to go see how this space has evolved in those times. Can you move to the next slide? So, you know, I went there because I was interested in issues of history, of power, of physical and geographical settings. What is interesting about Kosovo, it's actually the youngest population in all of Europe, and it's a generation that has grown up actually after the war, but with the physical remnants of what had come before. And so it was interesting to be there and do a digital photographic series of this generation that is trying to rebuild the borders and geographies and the physical spaces that they've inherited. I'm going to move to the next slide. In a very different kind of tone and temperament, moving to different places and traveling is a big part of my practice. And I recently went to the state of Jalisco in Mexico and visited this abandoned hacienda that in the 1960s was actually the location for a place that Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Barton, who at the time were 2 of the biggest celebrities in the world, were visiting. If you can move to the next slide. So at the time, you know, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Barton were living very public lives and having a very scandalous affair actually in front of the camera. And they retreat from view in the hacienda up in the Sierra Madre Mountains away from where Barton was filming Night of the Iguana. And the hacienda didn't have electricity. It was very hard to reach and very remote, and has essentially been abandoned since then. What's been left is like personal photos and mementos from their time there, and it has basically been left in a state of ruin. And so it's an interesting place to visit and kind of understand that interaction again of time, of memory, and of physical setting. If you can move to the next slide. Which brings me to my degree show project, which was the outcome of me being in Northern Italy and in Venice in late February when the Italian government started the first shutdown in Western Europe because of the coronavirus outbreak. And Venice is an interesting place to be when something like that happens, given its historical associations with the plague in medieval times. The word quarantine actually comes from the Venetian dialect for 40 days, which was how the Venetian authorities in the Middle Ages would try to stop the plague from entering the city by quarantining ships for 40 days in the lagoon in the outerlying areas. If you could move to the next slide. My time there brought me to kind of spend a lot of time researching how scientific organizations and medical organizations have been communicating with the press about the coronavirus and the process of scientific knowledge as it's developed in real time, which I think has been an education for most people that have been following this. Starting in late January, the World Health Organization started doing media briefings on the coronavirus. At the time, they didn't even have a name for it. They obviously continue till today. There are a series of almost personalities or characters who do these briefings that have become extremely well known within the science journalism community. Dr. Tedros, who's the Director General of the WHO, Dr. Mike Ryan, who directs the WHO's Health Emergencies Program, Dr. Maria Van Kerkhove, who's the COVID-19 technical lead. And I think it has been very interesting, for me at least, to do research on how their own knowledge has changed and evolved in the last 6 to 7 months of this pandemic, and how that communication process happens before the camera. You can move to the next slide. So my film, Plague, is really about this kind of spectacle of history, of the globalized forces that affect us, including the pandemic, and how individual moments in time, in memory, and in a physical place interact. I think, as I mentioned before, I'm very interested in the power of the visual image and how it reflects and absorbs reality at a specific place, at a specific time, but also how we then remember those things. So if you can move to the next slide. For more information, that's just my website and how to contact me, and the full film is on Vimeo on my site. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji. That was great. Next up, we have Claire McDermott. Claire's artwork is at the intersection between art and science and places her in a really interesting realm, as she's able to use both these methodologies to explore a floating seed and spent energy in nature. The main inspiration of her work is to link plants to the contemporary arts, with the initial focus being on spent plants, their individuality, unpredictability, and asymmetric contours. Taking these curiosities as an initiative, she creates a view to observe the irregularity and enigmatic aspects of nature. Claire's presentation is silent. Thank you, Claire, that was grand. Finally, we have Teresa Zerafa Byrne. who's going to show a video. By examining the relationship between sensory perception, awareness, and memory, Teresa's work seeks to understand which details of our experiences are significant and selected to be committed to memory for later recall.
I'm Teresa Zerafa Byrne, and these are my memory skeletons. A memory skeleton is a term I use to describe a core set of details that a person needs to recall each time they think of a memory for it to remain constant. As long as they recall the bones of the memory skeleton, they can flesh it out with extra details, but it will still feel like a memory of the same experience. The best way for me to explain what one of the bones within a memory skeleton could be is to guide you through one of the initial stages in my process. Think of a childhood memory. Ideally, it should be one that has an emotional significance to you. In your mind's eye, imagine you are there again and quickly run through the scenario. Now, without thinking too much about it, say to yourself 3 details that immediately come to mind. For this part of the process, the first couple of details are the most important. If you've recalled, for instance, a red dress, is the colour vital for the memory, or is it the item of clothing? The colour may have more significance. If you record the same experience, but instead visualised a red skirt, would the memory be more true than if you recalled a blue dress? The answer dictates which details may be important enough to be included within the memory skeleton. The order and positioning of the details or bones is an artistic process, but this also reflects how memory recall is akin to an artistic process in itself. We create memories afresh with each retelling, with differing importance and positioning each time, so the skeleton will be completed, but not necessarily in the same order. In these works, I attempt to convey the memory skeletons of one person's experience to another, hoping to prompt a sense of familiarity and affinity to the work. When viewed by another, the memory skeleton will have a different meaning and relevance to them. Just how our personal preferences, likes and dislikes affect our general perception, the registering of imagery prompts us to recall our own personal experiences.
Thank you, Teresa. I'd like to ask all the panelists to switch on their, my 4, to switch on their audio and their video so we can address some questions. And please, anyone, write some questions in the Q&A because there's lots to explore here. Thank you very much. Your presentations were all great. And because your work is also different, rather than a general question, I'm going to start off with a question to all of you. Firstly, to Di, can you talk about some of the materials you use to explore light and perception, as well as the can of paint and the glass jar?
Yeah, sorry. The materials that I use, I choose the materials depending on how they're going to bend or refract the light, really. I know how materials act, so they all have a different ability to change the direction of light and create shadows. So that's why I choose different ones.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you was, you work as an optometrist as well as an artist. Has your work as an artist impacted on your understanding of your work as an optometrist?
Yes, I would say that I've been an optometrist an awful lot longer than I've been an artist. And initially, when I started becoming an artist, it was very difficult to change from one to the other. And I soon realized that actually I didn't want to and I didn't need to, because my interests lie, even within the art field, in the very science of perception. So now I would definitely say that there's a much more dialogue going on between the two. There's a much more symbiotic, one feeds the other and the other, definitely there's a two-way street now. So I can talk with both hats on, yes.
Great. Raji, in your practice, you're interested in observing and looking, being in a specific moment in a specific place. This is very poignant in relation to you being in Venice, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was emerging with such ferocity. What was it like to be there, and how did it impact on the work you made?
You know, I would say, I know in the earlier session, someone asked about how the pandemic has affected their work. And I would say, personally, I think I was one of the first people kind of in London in my friend set who kind of had personally been somewhere other than maybe in Asia, where there had been a shutdown and a lockdown. When I came back to the UK, I was in a quarantine for 14 days. I live in the US, my parents are in the US, and I came here 2 days after my quarantine ended from Italy, and did another 14-day quarantine here in the US. So my personal life has really revolved around surviving this pandemic, logistically, and, you know, dealing with it. And I think that my personal interest in kind of following like the WHO guidance and learning about the disease was really because I, you know, was worried I would be sick. It was because I was in quarantine, because I was traveling across borders at a time when a lot of borders were closing. And I think that it was kind of almost inevitable that that's where my work would go. I think I'm also, you know, my background is actually neither in art nor in science. My background is in politics in the US, working in kind of liberal democratic policy here in the US. And so I'm actually very interested in health policy. And so it was kind of a natural avenue for me to kind of meld my personal understanding of what happened along with the historical and political things happening around us.
And what a place to be with in terms of masks. It was quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a very, very visual imagery there.
Unbelievable moment. Claire, what is the significance of the photographs you took for your work, White Hole?
That was me getting out there with balloons to experiment with how it felt to be a seed, to just get out there and do it. But what actually happened apart from that was that I realized that all my spent energy that I had used to blow up, it was just staring me in the face. It became a real thing, it became an object. And so then that sort of allowed me to then fork off to explore spent energy and the environment, what we can do. And so then that led me on to do more experimental work at La Jolla, which is a residency, and came away with lots of really good ideas. Well, the place just is very inspirational. So yeah, and this is what a piece that is a result of La Jolla, the residency there.
Lovely. We'll come back in a moment, but let's just move to Teresa. What is the significance of the materials and forms used within your memory skeletons?
Well, I like to play with the colours, the forms and the materials themselves as signifiers for the elements within the memory skeleton. And especially with sort of materials, I like to play with their properties. Often one material can actually be a signifier for multi reasons. For instance, in one of the pieces, the material I used was obviously cut into a shape that was one signifier, but then its inherent properties visually was another sort of layer. And then the third one was actually how the material was originally intended to be used. So it was actually a nod towards the industry that it would have actually been used for originally, so the history of that. And it gives a much richer sensory feeling to the pieces when you're sort of able to combine sort of more elements than just the one.
Indeed. We have a general question in from Lucy, who's asking you how the course has changed. This is throwing it open to all of you. How the course has changed your practice or your relationship between art and science, and whether that's an interesting question for you to look at. Di, do you want to start that?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I mean, my research project was all about the colour blue, my fascination with the colour blue, and I used how the eye is constructed to look at whether our opinions of blue artwork is influenced by how the eye sees colour blue. So it certainly has affected my opinion on that. Yes.
And also, just quickly, we've got a lot of questions from people asking you who composed your soundtrack. It's a chap called Scott Buckley, I think his name is, and it was on Free Music. But the film that I've done on my graduate showcase is by him as well, and I just have affinity to his work. So I felt it really fitted the ambience that I wanted to create, that kind of subtle music and the beats and such like. So yeah, I thought it worked well. He seems to have the same kind of idea as me. Yeah. Okay. Raji, have you anything to say about the art and science, or even political science, in the case of your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think I've said this in other settings sometimes. I mean, I think art and science are both ways to engage with the world. There are ways to think about ideas. There's ways to understand, to build knowledge. There are ways to kind of grapple with social issues, with political issues. And I'm interested in all of those issues. And so for me, art and science were both avenues and pathways to that. And so I feel somewhat agnostic in my preference for either or. It's just, I'm interested in life and people, in kind of history and politics. And so these are ways for me to get to that.
Great. Claire, two questions for you. One is, can you tell people what a Wardian box is? Because some of your work are Wardian boxes. And also the link between art and science for you in making those.
Wardian box is how historically a box that came that all plants would travel in from long journeys for plant collectors. So on the ships, they brought them back. They found at the beginning that plants would just die because the seawater, too much sun, too much water, So then they made these little cases here, so they could open them up, and they had little blinds and little compartments for the. Sounds really cute, but it's actually to keep the soils, all the pH, so they didn't mix, so that each plant had their own space, got their own watering, that sort of thing. So yeah, so that I use that as part of this series of works. And art and science, with plants, I've always been observing how they are and trying to understand them, and I think that's really what scientists and artists do, to try and understand the situation, and it's maybe conveyed in different ways. And I can use fantasy, which I have here, but also there's also facts in there as well. So it's like multiple layers. As maybe a scientist who has a rigid results, and then publishing. So it's sort of slightly, it's a different situation, but the observation, I think, is the first of it, which combines both science and art together.
Because you're such a maker, the sense of the Wardian box is that you've made them, and the sort of concepts and the ideas are sort of bursting out of them in a very sort of poetic way, and so the science is there, but it's exploded the art in a way. So it's interesting. Teresa, what about your relationship with scientists and in a time of MRI scans and all sorts of heavy technology, you bring to some very big scientific questions a very textured, tactile and original exploration of memory. Can you say some more about your relationships to science?
Yeah, well, I've come from a fine art background, and for me, the science element was always an interest. It was always what I was, I suppose, looking into with my work, but I never really had the backing for it, so I suppose the proof for things. It was always just my thoughts, and then sort of, explore that through my fine artwork. But then when I came onto the course, that gave me access to people I would never have been able to really reach on my own, through fantastic student people themselves who were scientists, just in day-to-day conversations. That's been fantastic. I've been able to have conversations I would have never been able to have with artists who haven't had that background in science as well. But then also the tutors and as yourself, and how you've got that grounding as well. And you also were able to have contact with scientists who are able to add that extra layer to the work for me. So sort of, so I suppose my work has been more influenced by science rather than being a scientific principle that's being proved or anything. But I think that's the whole course has been that. It's allows students to really discover their artwork with really, I suppose, more depth and variety.
One of the things that it's often very interesting with art and science students is that you come with a huge amount of background to your work. Raji, your work in politics before you came on the course has influenced your practice hugely, but has your artwork influenced your way of looking at politics, or do they just mesh in a particular way?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think my art practice feels like a way for an individual, for me, to kind of grapple with forces that are bigger than me and ideas that are bigger than me. When I worked in politics, I worked at a systemic level, thinking about how you affect societies. And so my artwork and my art practice feels like a very interior experience. And I think in some ways, I'm trying to provide interior moments for other people to grapple with things that often can feel overwhelming.
And Di, why is your obsession with blue?
Well, the physiology of blue is very different to all the colors. The way the receptor cells are set up in the eye, the pathway of blue to the brain is very different. So I was very interested in why we react to blue paint, particularly Yves Klein blue, why we have this special reaction to it. Is it a surface texture? Is it the color? Is it the wavelength of light that it creates? And it is a very interesting possible. Nothing is proven on why we love the color blue so much, but we do. We as humans, we have this special affinity to it. There's very little blue pigment in the world. Most of the blue that we see is due to different reactions or properties of light. So the sky isn't blue, it's just the way the light scatters. So the actual pigment is very, very rare. And that's another question, why is that so? Why can't we have blue pigment? So it's just a special color, and it is very different to everything else that we're looking at, in my opinion anyway.
Claire, I'm fascinated by your concept of spent energy. It's like trying to visualize the invisible in many ways. Can you tell us a bit more, I mean, how you visualize spent energy in your work?
Well, in this particular piece, the round circle of the balloon called White Hole led me to think about spent energy going all inside that round circle, but actually where does it go? And I, at the time when I was taking those photographs up on the scaffold, there was a discovery of a black hole in the universe, so that all my spent energy was going to this black hole. So that was my connection. So then with the La Jolla, I took all these photographs of the landscape of at sunrise and sunset, and this particular one here on the other side, inside the case, there's a picture of a blue and sunrise with white holes. So the light shines through here, and you see that landscape shining through that, that white hole on the landscape of that. But that was, I'm just trying to put in statements so that environmentally we can actually think about how we use energy, maybe be a bit more cautious and not, you know, so that's the whole concept behind spent energy. It's just to, you know, knuckle down, just not not use so much wasted electricity. That's.
Thank you. Well, we're hitting 8:30, and I'd like to thank you all for being so brilliant. And I would like to hand back to Nathan.
Thank you very much, Susan, and also to all of the panelists. As this concludes the presentations for the symposium, could all the presenters actually switch on their videos now so we can all see you? I'd like to thank all of the speakers for their contributions today, and also Adrian and Susan for chairing the two sessions so well. Also, a very, very big thank you to Heather for organizing this event. It's taken an awful lot of preparation to do this, and it's been I think it's we've seen the results tonight, and making sure it all comes together so well on the day. Thank you very much, Heather. And of course, thank you to all of you who attended and asked questions. It's your support that makes this so engaging and worthwhile. We will stay on for a few more minutes to answer any other unanswered questions in the Q&A. But if you've not already done so, please do visit the Graduate Showcase, where you can see details of all of the MA Art and Science graduates' work. And again, thank you to everyone for participating in this, the 2020 MA Art and Science Symposium.